I never wanted to move back home. It wasn't just the memories, those faded fragments of childhood that felt more like echoes than something real. It was the house itself, a squat, two-story structure at the edge of town, tucked behind a tangle of overgrown trees. It had been empty for years, left to settle into the silence after my parents passed. I'd thought about selling it, but something always stopped me. Some quiet reluctance I never quite understood. But life has a way of bringing you back to the places you tried to leave. When I lost my job and my lease in the same month, I had no choice but to return. It was temporary, I told myself, just long enough to get back on my feet. So, on a gray October afternoon, I pulled into the cracked driveway, staring at the house with the kind of unease one might feel when seeing an old acquaintance they'd rather avoid. Inside, it smelled of dust and stale air. The floors creaked under my weight, the sound hollow, as if the house had been waiting for someone to disturb its quiet. I went through the motions, unpacking, turning on the heat, checking the rooms one by one. Everything was just as I remembered. The slanted bookshelf in the study, the stubborn bathroom door that never quite shut all the way, the small attic hatch above the hallway just slightly ajar. That gave me pause. I didn't remember leaving it open. I shook off the unease, blaming it on a draft. The place had been empty for years. Of course, things had shifted. But as I moved through the house, flicking on lights and listening to the hum of the old wiring, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier somehow, like the house had been holding its breath. That night, as I lay in my childhood bedroom, the wind rattling the windows, I swore I heard something shift upstairs. A soft creak, like weight settling on old wood. I told myself it was nothing, but I didn't sleep easily. And in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had never truly been empty at all. The next morning, I chalked up the noises to my imagination. Old houses settle, I reminded myself. The wood expands, the pipes groan. It's nothing. But as I moved through the house, something felt different. The air inside was still, too still. No matter how many windows I opened, the place remained thick with a kind of stagnant weight, as if the walls had grown accustomed to silence and resented the intrusion. Even the light that filtered through the dusty windows felt dimmer than it should have, as if the house itself was swallowing it whole. It was small things at first. A chair I could have sworn I pushed under the table sat slightly askew when I passed by again. The kitchen faucet dripped, though I distinctly remembered turning it off tight. My reflection in the hallway mirror seemed a fraction slower than it should have been, lingering just an instant too long after I'd looked away. I blamed it on exhaustion, stress. The mind plays tricks when it's uneasy. That night, the noises returned. Soft creaks from the attic, slow and deliberate, like footsteps testing their weight. I lay stiff in bed, my breath shallow, every nerve alert to the sound. Then, faint but unmistakable, the rhythmic tap of something dragging across the floor above me. A branch against the roof, I told myself. A squirrel. Anything but what my mind was conjuring. I turned on the bedside lamp, the dim glow chasing the shadows into the corners of the room. The noise stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I barely slept. The next day, I decided to check the attic. The pull-down ladder groaned as I unfolded it, dust swirling in the stale air. The space above was cramped, filled with forgotten boxes and old furniture draped in white sheets. Nothing looked disturbed, but as I turned to leave, my eyes caught something in the dust-covered floorboards. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the attic hatch to the farthest, darkest corner of the room. The space beyond was empty, or at least it should have been. I stood frozen at the edge of the attic, staring at the footprints. They weren't fresh. The dust had settled into them, softening the edges, as if whatever had made them had been here for some time, watching, waiting. A cold, prickling sensation crept up my spine. I should have left right then. Instead, I did something foolish. I stepped forward. The wooden floor groaned beneath my weight, the sound swallowed instantly by the thick attic air. The footprints led to the farthest corner, where an old sheet-draped chair sat in the shadows. Something about it felt wrong. I hesitated, then slowly reached out, gripping the fabric between my fingers. I pulled. The sheet slumped to the ground, revealing a chair that was far too ordinary. Wooden, slightly warped with age, but the dust on its seat was disturbed. But the attic hatch was open wider than before. I was certain I hadn't left it like that. I backed away, heart pounding, nearly stumbling down the pull-down ladder in my rush to leave. My hands trembled as I shoved the attic door closed, the latch clicking into place with a finality that felt both reassuring and meaningless. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to stretch too far in the corners of rooms. The old mirror in the hallway reflected shapes that didn't belong. A faint, persistent creaking noise, too deliberate, too measured, echoed through the house like footsteps pacing just out of sight. By nightfall, I told myself I was being paranoid. The attic was just an attic. The noises were just the house settling. Then I heard it, a whisper, low and distant, coming from upstairs. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the pipes. It was something else, and it was calling my name. I didn't move. The whisper had been unmistakable, low and breathy, curling through the darkness like a thread unraveling. My name. I was sure of it. I turned toward the staircase, staring up into the second floor's yawning blackness. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then came another sound, a soft thump, like something shifting just beyond the top of the stairs. I should have left the house, driven to a motel, called someone, anyone. But instead, I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and forced my feet up the steps. The upstairs hallway stretched ahead of me, the air colder than it should have been. I swept the flashlight over the walls, catching glimpses of dust motes swirling in the beam. My old bedroom door stood ajar. Across from it, the bathroom mirror reflected the dim glow of my light. Then I noticed something strange. The hallway runner, a long, faded rug my mother had picked out years ago, had shifted. It was bunched near the attic hatch, as if something had been dragged across it, or as if someone had moved it on purpose. A sick, twisting sensation coiled in my stomach. I edged closer, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. That's when I saw it. A door. It was small, waist-high, set low into the hallway wall. I had lived in this house my entire childhood. I had walked this hallway 1,000 times, and yet I had no memory of this door. My breath hitched. Had it always been here? Dust clung to its frame, but the handle gleamed as if it had been touched recently. I hesitated, then crouched and pressed my palm against the wood. It was warm, too warm. I pulled my hand back and stood quickly, my skin crawling. This was wrong. deeply wrong. Then the whisper came again, but this time it was right behind me. I spun around, heart slamming into my ribs. The hallway was empty, silent. But I knew something had been there. I didn't sleep that night, but as I lay in bed, wide-eyed and waiting, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. By morning, I knew I had to open it. I didn't open the door, not at first. I wanted to. I needed to. But something about it felt wrong, as if touching it would unravel something I wasn't meant to see. So instead, I avoided it. For the rest of the day, I tried to go about things as if nothing had changed. I made coffee, flipped through an old book, even stepped outside for some air. But the house had changed. Or maybe I had. The silence felt heavier, pressing against me like an unseen weight. Shadows lingered longer in corners. The air itself seemed thick, making every breath feel labored. And then there were the whispers. They came in waves, curling around my ears in tones just below understanding. Never clear, never distinct, just the suggestion of voices, speaking about me rather than to me. I'd whirl around, expecting to catch someone standing behind me, but there was never anyone there. By nightfall, I was exhausted, nerves frayed from the constant feeling of being watched. Sleep felt impossible, but lying in bed was worse. The moment I closed my eyes, I could feel it. Something waiting. Sometime after midnight, I heard the creak. Not from the attic this time, from the hallway. My body locked up. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, just outside my door. A shuffling step, then another. My breath hitched as I reached for the bedside lamp, but my fingers fumbled against the switch. Then, a soft tap, right against my bedroom door. I stopped breathing. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. The handle twitched. Not turning, not forcing, just testing. I clenched the blankets in my fists, paralyzed. Minutes passed, maybe hours. But eventually, the sound faded. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I crept toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Nothing. No movement, no whispering. I exhaled shakily. The footprints, not mine, not even human, trailing away from my door, leading back to the small, forgotten door in the hallway, waiting. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The house wanted me to see, to know. The footprints, warped, elongated, pressing too deep into the wood, led straight to the small door in the hallway. I stood there, staring at it, my pulse thundering. My mind screamed at me to leave, to pretend I had never seen them, but something inside me had shifted. I had to open it. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. The brass was warm, pulsing faintly against my skin like a heartbeat. I swallowed hard and turned it. The door groaned open. A rush of stale, breathing air spilled out, thick with dust and something faintly metallic. Inside, a passage stretched into darkness, too deep for the small space it should have occupied. The wooden floorboards gave way to cold, packed earth, and at the far end, something waited. I lifted my flashlight, my breath ragged. The beam wavered across the walls, revealing old, curling wallpaper, familiar wallpaper. A nursery, my nursery. The rocking chair in the corner swayed gently, though there was no breeze. My childhood crib sat in the center of the room, untouched by time, its wooden bars gleaming in the dim light. My stomach twisted. This wasn't possible. The nursery had been on the second floor. It had been gone for years. I stepped inside, unable to stop myself. My foot sank into the dirt, and something crunched beneath it. I shone the flashlight downward. Tiny bones. I lurched back, bile rising in my throat. And then I saw it, etched into the crib's headboard. My name, not just once. Carved over and over again, some marks fresh, as if someone had been here recently. A sharp breath whispered behind me. I spun around. The door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed me whole. The whispering returned, this time rising in a chorus of hissing voices, pressing against me from all sides. The air turned suffocating. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something. I fell hard, dirt clinging to my skin. Then the crib creaked. Something inside it began to stir, and I wasn't alone anymore. The crib creaked again. Something shifted inside it, slow, deliberate, as if waking from a long, restless sleep. My breath hitched as I scrambled backward, my hands sinking into the damp earth. The flashlight lay just out of reach, its beam flickering weakly against the far wall. Then a sound, a wet, gurgling inhale. I forced myself to look. A shape rose from the crib, its movements unnatural, jerky like a marionette with tangled strings. The shadows clung to it, dripping from its limbs like ink. And then I saw its face, my own, but wrong. Its skin sagged, bloated and pale, as if it had been left too long beneath the earth. Hollow black pits where my eyes should have been. Its lips curled into something that might have been a smile, until it stretched too wide, splitting open with a sickening crack. It lifted one skeletal hand and pointed at me. "You left me," it rasped, voice brittle with age. "You forgot." A rush of memories slammed into me, fragments of childhood nights, dreams I had long dismissed, waking up screaming. My mother's worried whispers, the locked door at the end of the hall, the one I had never questioned, the one they told me never to open. I hadn't imagined the cries in the night, the rustling under my crib, the feeling that something else had been there, watching me as I slept. They had sealed it away, and now I had let it out. The thing in the crib twisted, its body cracking, unfolding in ways it shouldn't. It crawled over the crib's edge, its two long fingers digging into the wood. I staggered to my feet, my mind screaming for me to move, but the room itself seemed to warp around me. The walls pulsed like a living thing, the ground beneath me shifting. It was pulling me in. The thing grinned wider. "Come back," it whispered. The nursery door exploded open. A rush of wind, cold, howling, filled with voices I couldn't understand, tore through the room. The entity shrieked, its form distorting, unraveling like smoke, and suddenly I was falling. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was my own hand reaching out from the crib. I hit the ground hard, but it wasn't earth beneath me anymore. I gasped, sucking in air, my chest burning. My hands scraped against wooden floorboards. The suffocating darkness was gone, replaced by the dim glow of morning light filtering through a dust-covered window. I was back in the house. Had I imagined it? Had I blacked out? But something was wrong. The hallway stretched before me, but the wallpaper was different, older, curling at the edges. The colors faded as if decades had passed. My hands trembled as I reached for the nearest wall. The house felt the same, but it wasn't the same. Then I saw the door. The nursery was gone. Instead, a dimly lit corridor stretched far beyond the space the house should have allowed, lined with doors. I turned, heart hammering, and caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My breath hitched. It was me, but younger, a child. My body shook as I lifted trembling hands. small and unfamiliar, my fingers barely reaching my chin. The reflection blinked back at me with wide, terrified eyes. This wasn't my house anymore. This was the past. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned slowly. A woman stood at the end of the hallway, her face cast in shadow. My mother's voice drifted toward me, soft and distant. "Time for bed, sweetheart." My pulse pounded in my ears. My legs refused to move. The shadows at her feet stretched toward me, crawling over the floor like grasping fingers. And then, behind her, from the open door of the nursery, the crib creaked. The whispering began again, rising into a familiar, rasping voice. "You left me." My mother took a step forward. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. The door behind me slammed shut, and I remembered. This had happened before. I had never left this house, and I never would. I ran, small feet pounding against the warped floorboards, breath hitching in my tiny lungs. The hallway stretched endlessly, doors lining the walls. Too many, more than there should have been. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, stretching toward me like grasping hands. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whispering followed me, soft at first, then louder, closer. A chorus of voices overlapping, merging into something inhuman. "You left me. You forgot. Come back." The hallway twisted. The walls pulsed like they were breathing. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing down on me like unseen hands. My tiny fingers scrabbled for a door, any door. I wrenched one open, my heart hammering in my chest, and froze. I was back in the nursery. The crib stood in the center, untouched, draped in shadows. The rocking chair beside it moved gently, creaking in the dim light. Something was sitting in it. Not my mother, not human. A shape, barely visible, just out of focus. Wrong in ways my mind couldn't fully comprehend. It turned its head toward me, slow and deliberate, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all. A shifting blur of hollow eyes, two wide smiles, and something deeper, something endless. A nursery rhyme drifted through the air, distorted and distant, like a broken music box winding down. I backed away. The figure stood. "Time for bed," it whispered in my mother's voice. A cold hand closed around my wrist. I screamed, and the world snapped. I gasped, bolting upright. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window. My bedroom, the old house, was gone. My apartment walls were bare, my nightstand exactly where it should be. Just a nightmare. Just a nightmare. I exhaled shakily, rubbing my temples. My skin felt clammy. My sheets tangled around me. I reached for my phone and stopped. My fingers trembled. There on my wrist, where the cold hand had grabbed me. A bruise, small, faint, but unmistakable. A child's handprint. The crib creaked. Somewhere in the shadows of my room. And this time, it wasn't a dream.